to the Australian Hiker Podcast, Australia's longest-running hiking podcast, downloaded over 1 million times worldwide and providing you with an Australian perspective on all things hiking. We're your hosts, Tim and Jill Savage, coming to you from Ngunnawal and Ngambri country.
In this week's episode 314, we talk about the Snowman Trek in Bhutan. We hope you enjoy. If you'd like to help support Australian Hiker and this podcast, there are a couple of ways that you can help us out. Firstly, by subscribing on your podcast host of choice so that each episode is available as soon as it's published. And if you have the opportunity, leave us a 5-star review. Another way to support us is go to the Australian Hiker website at www.australianhiker.com.au and click on the Support Us page and buy us a coffee. You can do a one-off donation or become a monthly supporter. All donations are greatly appreciated and help us to continue producing this podcast and blog. Now let's get on to today's episode. In 2012, we hiked in Bhutan, and at that time we were trying to decide between two hikes. One of the choices we were looking at was the 350-kilometre Snowman Trek, which we didn't go for. But this track is one of Bhutan's, and for that matter, one of the world's best-known tracks, taking around 24 days to complete the whole hike. In today's episode, we catch back up with hiker Jonty Crane, who we last talked to in Australian Hiker Podcast episode 307. In this episode, we talk to him about his on-trail experience on the Snowman Trek. For me, this is a bucket list hike and one that I've been keen to find out more about. Jonty, thanks for taking the time to chat with us about the Snowman Trek.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me back.
Now, in episode 307, we caught up with you to talk about hiking in Timor-Leste. What have you been up to hiking-wise since that time?
So I got back from Timor back to Wellington, New Zealand 2 or 3 weeks ago. And so before I left Timor, every day I was going out for a hike, making the most of my kind of final time there. And now I've just been enjoying the hills of Wellington and the somewhat cooler climate, although it's easy to forget how windy it is in Wellington. So I was up at the tops yesterday and getting blown over and go, this is quite a contrast to the last month when I was sweating away in tropical temperatures. So it's nice to be back in Wellington. It's an amazing city for hiking. Just walk out my back door and then 2 minutes I'm up into the hills and the bush. And yeah, it's a real pleasure to be home.
Now, I believe you also did the Kangaroo Island Wilderness Trail over the last month.
I did, yes, well remembered. So we did a bit of a stopover in Australia on the way back. And I listened to the recordings, the podcasts about your experience on the Kangaroo Island Wilderness Trail, because you did it before the fires, after the fires?
Before the fires.
Before the fires. And it looks like it's pretty restored. Like there's obviously some bits where you could see stuff that had been burnt out, but otherwise it was very lush vegetation. I was the only person on the trail. I was the only person starting that day, and obviously you need to do it in the order in terms of campsite. So it was a real kind of wilderness experience, 4 days by myself. It was very dry, I have to say. So I walked this kind of mid-February, and there's a lagoon towards the end, which is, the blurb says this lagoon is a haven for wildlife all year round. It always has water in it, and it was completely dry. And the rangers were saying that was the first time they'd seen it completely dry. So they've had a very dry summer this year. I was very lucky. I know you had issues with the fire ban. So I think the day after I finished, they had a total fire ban. And then the week before I did the hike, they were having like 40-degree heat waves. So I got this nice little window. It was a bit cloudy and overcast, but actually that just made it, the temperature is a lot more bearable. So yeah, it's a beautiful trail. And it was quite a nice contrast from both hiking in Timor and also quite different to hiking in New Zealand in terms of the landscape and some of the infrastructure.
Okay, so when we caught up with you last time, you mentioned you'd completed the Bhutan Snowman Trek in 2019, and this is one of my bucket list hikes. So I was keen to find out more. How did you decide to do this hike?
So I was doing a bit of Googling, as you do, and I was like, what are the hardest hikes in the world? Just a bit of a random question. I think it's because I'd been looking at, I'd done the Kokoda track, and that is often ranked as one of the hardest hikes in the world. And so the Snowman Trek kind of came up on that list, and I I sort of may have vaguely have heard of Bhutan and how difficult it was to visit or how few people went there, but I didn't really know much about it. So I did a bit of kind of research into it, and it looked like a interesting trek. Basically, it takes the best part of a month. It's very kind of high altitude, and it's very rarely walked. I'm sure we'll come on to it later in terms of some of the logistical and financial challenges, but as a comparison, there's probably only between 50 and 100 people a year would walk the full Snowman Trek. Mount Everest summit, last year, I believe there was about 800 people went to the summit of Mount Everest. So that's kind of mass tourism in comparison with the Snowman Trek. So that's kind of always appealing to do something which is organized and is possible to do, but also very few other people do it. And so you get that real wilderness kind of experience. And then also so I think there was the attraction of the hike itself. It goes through quite a variety of landscapes, and it's like an interesting kind of physical and mental challenge. And then also the country. I know that, Tim, that you've been to Bhutan, and Bhutan is a particularly interesting country to visit. So that was kind of a bonus. And there was a lot of culture both before and after the trek, and also during the trek. So that's kind of makes it more. It just adds to the experience. It's not just about the wildlife and the scenery; it's also about the culture and the people of the country.
I must admit, one of the things I found really interesting about Bhutan when we went, it was a lovely place. The environment was spectacular. The people were really nice. But we found out that at this stage, and I'm not quite sure if it's still the case, that there's nothing stopping you from going and doing your own walk, but you get charged more for the service. So it's actually cheaper to hire a guide, and that's the whole idea, that they want you to engage with local employment. And it means you've got someone who knows the area really well and can take you through and show you what's going on. Was that still the case that you were aware of, or you just decided that the guided option was going to be the way to go anyway?
Well, my understanding was always that, so Bhutan has this thing called, I think it's the Sustainable Development Fund, but it's basically a tourist tax. And so every day that you're in country, it is now $100. I think it was maybe 85 or maybe less when I did it. But it's $100 a day. And when I did it, there was very much, you got like a package. So basically you paid the tax, and then you got your accommodation and your food, and your kind of guide was all kind of included. I believe now they have broken it out so that you can separately purchase those things, but it's a bit clunky and complicated. It's easier again to do it through an organized tour. So but basically, so you get taxed, and you have to have a tour guide. I believe you have to have a tour guide with you kind of basically at all times. So they pick you up from the airport, drop you off at the airport, and they kind of make sure that you don't do anything naughty as a tourist, which some people, I think they've seen what's happened in other countries with kind of over tourism and some of the behavior that tourists kind of get up to.
Now, before we go much further into your trip, paint us a picture of this well-known hike.
Bhutan is about the size of Switzerland. It's one of the last kind of surviving independent countries up in the Himalaya. So obviously Tibet's now part of China, and Ladakh is part of, and Ladakh and Sikkim are part of India. So, once upon a time, there was quite a lot of these kind of Himalayan states along the mountain range, and Bhutan's one of the few that's kind of maintained its kind of independence, primarily because it's very inaccessible. It was only probably 50, 60 years ago that there was any kind of real way to get into or out of the country. So if you think about the Himalayan chain, and on your far west, you've got kind of Pakistan, and then you're going to go through a bit of India, and then you're going through Nepal. And then, so it's basically to the east of Nepal. So it's quite, the eastern side of the Himalayan range. And it's only got a population of 800,000 people. So it's quite a small population for a reasonable sized country, very forested, very thickly forested. And then towards the northern areas, which is where the hike goes, you're getting into real kind of high altitude kind of things. It doesn't have the mountains of Pakistan or Nepal in terms of some of the highest peaks in the world. I think their highest peak might be on the 20th or 30th. Like the mountains, I mean, they're still massive. They're 6,000-7,000 meter mountains, but there's no 8,000 meter mountains in Bhutan. And a lot of the trek basically kind of goes north and along close to the border with Tibet. So you'll see a whole bunch of mountains, and the summit of those mountains is the border between Bhutan and Tibet. It's about 350 kilometers. So it's a reasonable distance, and it takes the kind of best part of a month, depending on the itinerary and the operator you go with. It has over 11 passes over 4,500 meters, and then the highest pass is nearly 5,500 meters. So you spend a lot of time at altitude, and that's one of the real challenges physically. Is I've done other hikes where you go up over a high pass, but then you come back down again to slightly lower. This you start quite high, you go higher, you go even higher, and so you're spending a long time at kind of altitude along the way. But you get a lot of variety. Like there's forests, there's mountain passes, there's some beautiful lakes, there's some nice rivers. There's some sort of desert-like areas which were quite kind of surreal to see, and it's very particularly the last probably third of the hike, the Luana region, is very remote. Like there are no settlements there. We went days without seeing any kind of anybody else, basically. And if you did see anything, it will be a yak herder. Yak herders are quite hardy folk, and so you see this kind of pile of stones with a tarpaulin over the top, and that's where the yak herders will shelter up. But it's a full kind of camping exhibition. It's not something you can do by yourself. You wouldn't be able to carry the supplies. Like you need to go with a crew. They use horses or yaks to carry all the gear, and then for the first week or so you are not in campsites, but you're at people's houses or settlements, or so there's a little bit of habitation, but then you get into proper remote wilderness kind of hiking. The route, so these number of some of the best known hikes in Bhutan. There's the Jolamari, which is a pretty notable mountain, and there's a 6-day circuit there, and there's an 8-day trek there, and then there's an 11-day Lai Gaza trek. So, and then there's Snowman. So basically, all those 4 treks do the same kind of first 6, 8, 11 days. And I read somewhere that nearly half of all the hikers to Bhutan do that kind of section, and then other people kind of come back, and then the Snowman kind of continues on. Because Tim, I understand you did the Lai Gaza. When was that?
That's right. That was in 2012. So 12, almost 13 years ago now.
Because Lyra is just a beautiful. I mean, it's probably less than 1,000 people, but it's still the biggest settlement that you pass through on the Snowman Trek. And in Bhutan, they've got very quite strict rules, which there is some upside. So, for example, locals, they have to wear their traditional clothing in order to go and visit any kind of government offices or go to the temple. And so that kind of keeps that tradition alive. And then the buildings, the facades have to be of a certain kind of design, and they're these beautiful hand painted buildings basically, and it's funny, the building behind might just be a concrete structure, but they've got quite strict kind of planning rules about how the facade needs to be designed, and so there's some really beautiful kind of buildings in the middle of nowhere. So as mentioned, in terms of the location, so Bhutan's on the far kind of eastern end of the Himalaya, and therefore it gets a lot of the monsoon rain. And also it's very high, so it gets a lot of snow. So there is this kind of narrow window between the end of the monsoon season and the beginning of the winter season, in which you can't start. If you started sooner, it's just going to be wet every day. You're not going to see anything. And if you start too late, then the highest passes are actually towards the end of the trek, and they can be blocked with snow. So there's quite a narrow window. Now, when I did it, I think we started mid-September. And interestingly, the mountain company who I went with, which I'll talk about in a moment, they've now moved their itinerary back a couple of weeks. So every year they tweak it based on previous conditions, and they've seen quite a big change with climate change. So the weather patterns in the Himalaya are changing, and they're more unpredictable, and things like the monsoons tend to be arriving later. And so that's why they've shifted it back to more like an October kind of period for doing the hike. But it means there's not really. So often if people visit Bhutan for hiking, there's an even smaller kind of window, and they go in the good weather. But because you need a month, the window's not that long. So basically, generally certainly my experience was the first week or so, or actually sort of 2 weeks in our case, it was quite kind of overcast. I mean, the cloud cover was probably still at 5,000 meters. So, you can still see stuff, but the big mountains were kind of a bit hidden. And then it cleared up to kind of beautiful kind of blue skies towards the end. And we got out, thankfully, before any kind of snow kind of blocked the passes. It was interesting. We went to one of the villages, and they had, the kids were at school, and they take a break for winter because they just can't access the school because they have to walk to the village. And I think it's like off the top of my head, it was 2 to 3 months the school is closed over winter just because there's so much snow and it's so kind of remote. So, that's one of the things to kind of consider is it's like I did a big hike in Nepal and the weather was perfect the whole time. Bhutan just has a slightly different kind of weather kind of pattern. But as I say, the mountain company, they're the operator I went with. So that's particularly for the Snowman, you need to kind of go with an operator, and there's probably about half a dozen companies out there that do this. So World Expeditions will probably be the best known for those listening to this podcast because it's kind of Australian based. There's Mountain Madness, which is American. There's Himalayan Expeditions, which is Canadian, and there's KE, which is based in the UK. And then there's the mountain company who I've used a few times now, who are also based in the UK. Now, one thing to note if you're looking into this is checking the itinerary. So the mountain company are the only ones that do the longer version of the Snowman. So the others tend to take a bit of a shortcut towards the end, and they save 2 or 3 days, which makes the trip a bit cheaper because you haven't got that daily tax for a few days. But I have to say, some of the best scenery was at the end. So that's one of the. I think I had a very excellent service with the mountain company. That all they do is hikes in the Himalaya, and they very much focus on remote, extreme, long kind of hikes. That's their kind of thing. Like they will do the Annapurna circuit, but their Roland who runs it is really interested in finding new routes and doing kind of the less traveled kind of areas of the Himalaya. And so, I had an amazing experience with them. I'd highly recommend them. And they do this kind of full itinerary. The other companies as well, they also run it. They'll have a local partner with Bhutanese operators. And the thing, I mean, is an experience whatever you do, but certainly that last kind of section, I was like, this was really quite amazing up to like Lake Shoreham, and it would have been a shame to have not seen that if I'd done a different itinerary.
Was this a carry everything type of trip, or did the porters carry the heavy gear, leaving you with the day pack?
So basically they bring all the infrastructure in terms of the tent, the food, obviously the cruise, they sort out the permits, that very well stocked first aid kit, satellite phone. They had something which I hadn't come across before, which I keep calling the body bag. I think it's probably called a decompression bag or something, which was quite interesting kit. And I'd highly recommend if anybody's doing any hiking anywhere, basically at high altitude, probably 4,000 meters plus, particularly if it's 5,000 meters plus, it's worth checking that the operator carries one of these decompression bags with them, because not all will. And if you're suffering from altitude sickness, which is a risk at this kind of altitude, and it's not something which is necessarily based on age or fitness, it can strike anybody, and it can vary between trips. Sometimes you can have it and sometimes not. So if you're suffering from altitude sickness, you basically get you go into this bag and they they zip it up, and it's got they can basically pump the air or change the air pressure within the bag, and they can adjust the air temperature by effectively up to 1,000 meters. So if you're at 4,500 meters, they can make it so your body thinks it's 3,500 meters, which is a massive, that's making a big difference. They have to be quite careful using it, because you can, with your eardrums, if they change the pressure too quickly, you can burst your eardrums. But I was speaking to a friend of mine who I did the Snowman trip with 6 years ago. I saw him, I hadn't seen him for 6 years, and I saw him on Friday, so it was kind of well timed for this podcast. He did another trip with the mountain company out in Dolpo in western Nepal, and there was a lady on the trip who got really bad altitude sickness, and it was like, basically, you're going to die unless we can get you out of here ASAP. In the meantime, they put her in the bag, and that kind of kept her stable, and then they managed to get a helicopter rescue off the mountain. So you need to make sure your insurance covers the cost of a potential helicopter rescue. So, hopefully it doesn't happen, but it's best to be prepared for the worst case. So that's that's, I guess, one of the advantages, and particularly with they have an international or Western guide, and then they have the local crew. So, they're bringing some of that kind of health and safety experience with them. So they provide that. And then you need to kind of bring your sleeping bag, your sleeping mat, your clothes, anything else you kind of want to bring with you. Category 4 sunglasses. So, this is what I learned when I started doing how to choose. There's different darknesses of lenses, and you really need Cat 4, which is the highest level if you're going to be up high, just because the sun's that much brighter. Part of the equipment list that we had to bring with us, but we didn't actually end up using, but they're quite useful to have anyway, are micro spikes. So they're kind of crampons for beginners. They're a lot easier to use than crampons and to fit them onto your shoes. And so we brought those along in case there was any snow or ice. An umbrella, I found super helpful because, it said first couple of weeks, it did rain quite a lot generally after we got to camp, and just having an umbrella, like there wasn't, particularly when you're outside of the forest areas, it's pretty open and you can easily use a brolly. And I guess on the equipment side of things, a couple of things I wish I had brought with me, which I kind of learned for future trips, was I'd taken like 2 or 3 down jackets, but they weren't super thick. But my theory was layering, and if I wore 3, that would be okay. That wasn't quite enough. So since then, I bought a proper, very thick kind of down jacket with a waterproof external, which is made a big difference. And then I discovered on the Snowman, because somebody else had them, you can get these down booties. I don't know if you've ever come across these, but it's your hands and your feet are going to get cold. And so down booties were a game changer when I bought them for the next time. But yeah, on the Snowman, I was ending up wearing 3 pairs of socks, which wasn't quite as effective. And also a hot water bottle. I'd highly recommend hot water bottles because it's just, particularly when you're at camp, you're spending a reasonable amount of time at camp and you're sitting around and you will get cold. So yeah, that's kind of the main thing from an equipment perspective.
So speaking of temperatures, what were they like during the trip?
Daytime was kind of moderate. I'm trying to think, it was probably going to be in the teens. Yeah, I don't think it got probably more than 20 degrees, probably less than that. So quite comfortable kind of hiking temperatures. As we got higher, obviously it gets colder, and obviously it's colder overnight. So the coldest point was at Lake Shoreham, where we were camping, which was over 5,000 meters above sea level. My water bottle froze inside my tent. So that suggests it was quite cold. And I believe somebody measured it at being about -10 inside the tent. So it's cold. Like, and I struggle a bit with the cold. All the people who shared a tent were actually fine, but there was 3 of us who had our own tents, and we're the ones who were who were cold. So either take a buddy or take a hot water bottle to help with the temperatures. But certainly, yeah, because when I was hiking, especially if you're kind of going uphill, then you're getting quite warm, and I'd be in probably shorts and the hiking shirt. But then we'd stop probably once an hour just to make sure everybody kind of bunched up together, or we'd stop for lunch. And then you're like, okay, so whenever in my day pack, I'd carry 3 or 4 layers. So when we stopped for a meal or stopped for a bit, then I could kind of layer up, because the air, it was cold and could be a bit windy. It's fine when you're hiking, but it's the stopping that's the challenge.
So what was the food situation like? Was it good?
Yes. So yeah, all the food's good. Very good food, I have to say, particularly given the remoteness and the challenges of getting food out there. That is a big consideration. Because you want a bit of variety, and you also need enough protein and various things, because you are expending quite a bit of energy keeping yourself warm and doing the hiking. They've invested in, they do a lot of, particularly for vegetables, they dehydrate a lot before they go, so they can take them with them. And I think we pretty much would have had meat available every day as well. And if anybody's a coffee lover, they've got, it's a Bialetti Mocha coffee machine. I'm not a coffee drinker, but I think that's a decent coffee machine. So that's obviously, if you're a coffee drinker, it's a priority. And so they make sure that, they carry a coffee machine with them, along the way. So you'd have quite a good, kind of breakfast with kind of porridge and cereal, and then sort of toast, eggs and sausages and fruit, breakfast. Then lunch. Again, it's interesting hiking between Nepal and Bhutan. So in Nepal, they tend to cook a lunch at lunchtime. Like they will set up they'll set up the stoves, and they'll cook a fresh meal. In Bhutan, what they do is they cook the lunch in breakfast time, and they put it into thermo, like a thermos kind of flask kind of containers, and that would typically be maybe some vegetables, maybe a bit of meat and some rice, and then we'd have that at lunchtime. So that was actually, I think, in some ways better, because you weren't having to stop for as long, and then you could have, you eat then, and then you'd have a few snacks when you get back to camp in sort of mid-afternoon. And then for dinner, you'd always have like a soup to start with, then probably some rice, meat, vegetables, sometimes some pasta, and then there would normally be a dessert after that. So yeah, certainly I didn't go hungry. There was plenty of food. And again, that's something to consider when you think of any kind of big treks like this. Do read the reviews and look at the operators and see what people say about the food, because that makes such a big difference. And I think having the same, so I think the guides, the 2 lead guides for for this hike, the Snowman Trek, with the mountain company. They've done it every year for 13 years. And so they know this trek really well. And I think the same with the chef has been doing it for probably 10 years. And every year they take the feedback from people and then they make improvements and tweaks. So I've seen that a few with, particularly, Nepal and Himalayan kind of hiking. It's good to have an established kind of crew. It's just a lot slicker kind of operation, which you would appreciate.
And what was the water situation?
Yeah, that's the same. So it's all boiled, and I mean the streams would have been probably fine to drink from anyway up in the altitude. But it's good to be safe and try and avoid getting any stomach bugs.
Describe a typical day on the trail for us.
So sunrise is normally around 5:30, 6 o'clock. So kind of wake up around then. They would bring hot water for washing, and if you wanted a coffee or tea at sort of 6:30ish. Breakfast at 7, start walking at 8. And then lunch would normally be around kind of midday. And then we'd actually get to camp reasonably early. On a couple of occasions early on, we actually got to the camp before the camp had been set up. Just because the first couple of days on these treks, especially if they've got new members of crew or new porters, they're trying to just get themselves kind of organized into an efficient routine. So we tend to get to camp between about 1:30 and 3:30, although we were quite a fast-paced group. And that was good because often it would rain kind of late afternoon and we typically kind of miss the rain or get there just as the rain kind of started. And then they would normally give us some hot water so you can have a bit of like a little bowl so you can have a bit of a wash. And then some snacks in mid-afternoon and dinner. And then after dinner every day we'd do statistics relating to altitude. So they have a little blood oxygen level meter that check the pulse, your pulses, and there's this thing called Lake Louise score. So I think they did some studies at Lake Louise in the US relating to altitude, and so it's kind of the first two are kind of quantitative. Here's some numbers. The Lake Louise is like, here's 10 or 12 statements. I've lost my appetite, or I have a headache, or those kind of things. And you kind of go to the questions and you go, okay, I'm a 3 today, or I'm a 6 today, and that's another way that they can gauge if there's any issues with the altitude. So that was good from a health and safety perspective, and it makes it quite transparent because often what is possible is that people, if you don't do that, they say they're feeling fine. Yeah, I'm fine. Oh, I just need to sleep well. I'm fine, and then they have a big issue. It's common to think you're going to get through. It's going to be fine, but particularly with altitude, it doesn't tend to just hit straight away. It does. You do have some symptoms that kind of are telltale signs. So that was a good way of just making, and also that affects the group, because if suddenly you've got to wait for a helicopter rescue, the group's got to get delayed for a day to wait. So you very much as a unit, and everybody wants to get out of there alive, and so you want to make sure that you're looking after each other. So that was a good way of making sure that everybody was kind of in a good condition. Like I've done 5 hikes at altitude, 2 without Diamox, 3 with Diamox, and it makes such a massive difference. And so I would never do anything at altitude without taking Diamox. And I tend to start taking it pretty much as soon as I start hiking, or as soon as we're over above 3,000 meters, start taking it just twice a day, I think it's a quarter of a half a tablet. It's better to take it 12 hours apart, and then it kind of evens out the flow rather than just taking once a day. Then it gets a bit kind of lumpy. And it was interesting because there's on all the hikes on altitude, there's always a number of people who don't take the Diamox. They've got it with them, but they're like, no, I'm just gonna see how it goes naturally. And then they get to a point in the trek where they're feeling really bad, and then they start taking it, and Diamox takes a day or two to kick in. And it was so that placebo effect you're talking about. It was interesting with the blood oxygen levels. There was a guy who hadn't been taking Diamox. He got to a certain altitude, and his blood oxygen was like noticeably lower than the rest of the group. And then he started taking Diamox, and within kind of 36 hours, he was up 15% in terms of his blood oxygen. You could just see the impact on the results in terms of the difference it made, because you really want to be having blood oxygen around 90%, 85-90% is where you want to be. And he was down at like 70%. And it's like, no wonder you're really struggling. So, definitely. It's pretty easy to get a prescription of Diamox, and makes a massive difference for these hikes. I think my description of being at altitude is, imagine aging like 40 years overnight. Like everything's creaky and everything's really hard work, and your pace is half what it normally is. And it does. You do need to make sure you've got time for acclimatization. And I think, again, that's when you're looking at a tour operator for this hike or any other hikes at altitude, look at the itinerary and look at a range of itineraries and really think about and check, do they have acclimatization days in there? The general rule is you don't go up more than about, I think it's 500 meters a day or more than 1,000 meters in 3 days. In terms of where you're sleeping, you obviously want to hike high and then sleep low if where possible. Because you see these people who do it on Mount Kilimanjaro, they do it on Everest Base Camp. They're like, oh, I've only got 5 days to do this hike, and so I'm going to do the shortest way possible. And those are the ones that tend to have issues. And you're like, is it really worth risking your life for the sake of 2 extra days leave? And particularly if you're going to do some trips, so like it takes time to go to these places and you want to enjoy it. And you're not talking about weeks of extra time, but often just an extra couple of days at the beginning to really acclimatize makes a big difference. And that's actually, so this itinerary with the mountain company, you don't start the Snowman Trek immediately. You get into Paro, you go and visit the Tiger's Nest Monastery, which if anybody's seen any photos of Bhutan, you've seen a photo of the Tiger's Nest Monastery. It's the kind of icon of the country. It's this kind of 1,000-meter up temple clinging onto the side of these cliffs. It's quite a spectacular place. And then we spent 2 days in the Har Valley, which is just to the west of Paro, which is quite beautiful in itself, but we're doing acclimatization hikes and getting used to it. And then we started the Snowman. And then pretty much once a week, we'd have like a day off just to help with the acclimatization and kind of rest and recovery.
Now, onto the experience itself. What is there to love about this trail?
Oh, lots of things. I think it's quite varied. And the scenery, yeah, it does get better as you go on, which is always, you don't want to start with the highlight and then go downhill. But so, like, particularly, as I say, Lake Shoreham, which is this just stunning kind of glacial lake at 5,000 meters surrounded by snow-capped peaks. I remember that as like a particular kind of visual highlight. There's not a lot of wildlife because it's pretty high up. There is this national animal called takin, which is very rare to see. I remember seeing lots of crows. And there's that kind of general sense of remoteness, I think, just that you are so far away from anywhere, which is quite appealing. And then as mentioned, the culture. So each, I don't know what they call it, province or region or area of Bhutan, they have this thing called zongs with a D, silent D. And it's funny. So from the outside, it looks like a castle or fortress. And on the inside, half of it is generally a Buddhist temple. And the Buddhist temples are beautiful, kind of similar to kind of Tibetan Buddhism. And then the other half of the zong is your local government office. So if you need to go and pay tax or get married or do any like government administrative activities, you go to the local zong and have to wear their traditional clothing. So that's just, they're interesting things to see. And yeah, I enjoyed that. As I said earlier, the house facades are beautiful, traditional dresses. I mean, Bhutan is famous for its festivals, but the timing of the Snowman, it might be different now. It's a bit later. It doesn't really align up, unfortunately, with the festivals. But the festivals tend to be a big draw cast for tourists, so they tend to be kind of one of the busier times of year. And then we were walking, it's halfway through the hike, we're pretty remote, and we're coming down to this village, and people were yelling at me, like go. And I'm like, I could see where our campsite was, and there was this large sort of flat expanse of greenery, and I'm like, well, it's like the end of the day. I'm just walking straight towards the tents, and they're like, no, stop. I'm like, what's going on? And then I stop, and then this arrow whizzes by my head, and I'm like, whoa, okay. So they're having an archery competition. So the national sport of Bhutan is archery, and they're amazing. Like the Bhutanese archery, the targets are 140 meters away from the shooter. Now, I think that is quite a lot further than even like Olympic archery. Like this is really impressive archery. And when they do the archery competition, they all have to wear their traditional dress, which is this kind of wraparound shawl kind of outfits, but they can wear whatever footwear they want. So they've all got the latest Nike sneakers with this traditional gear on. And then they've got these like, I think if you win these competitions, you can get quite good prize money. They've got very nice like carbon fiber kind of bows. So it's quite an interesting combination of the old and the new. And then I was like, oh, okay, right. Okay, I'll go the long way round. And then it was just fascinating to watch this archery competition, which was, so there's every few days you see that, or you go and visit a yak herder's, sort of shack, and they have this cheese, which is almost, well, for a Western palate, almost inedible, but that's kind of what the locals kind of love. Cause, the national food actually on the food side of things, because the Bhutanese, actually their national dish that they eat is chili cheese. So basically it's a rice with melted cheese with a lot of chilies thrown in. It's super spicy and hot. Very much acquired taste, but that's kind of what they love to eat. So, so I think it's the overall experience. I think that's the thing I like about the Snowman. It's like the whole kind of experience. There was some hikes you're like, well, there was 3 really scenic bits, and then there was some other bits in between. But I think it's just the overall kind of experience. That's what I kind of really take home with me.
And are insects a problem over there, or is it like sort of some of the climates where you get eaten, or is it pretty good?
Luckily, the higher you go, the less things there are to bite you. So there was no mosquitoes, no sandflies, no bugs or anything along the way. There was one spot towards the end where there was a wasp's nest, which the guides knew about, and we took a sort of detour off the track to avoid this wasp's nest. But other than that, there wasn't anything. Actually, something I forgot to mention, which was another highlight of the trip, was there's these amazing hot springs about, again, probably 2/3 of the way through the hike. And they're actually a sort of pilgrimage site for locals. And there's probably half a dozen little huts where they've sort of built them around these hot springs, and they're of slightly different temperatures, and they're not sort of next to each other. They're sort of scattered along by the side of this river. And that was there was 2 opportunities to have a wash basically on the hike. We had a tent bucket shower at Lyre, and then we had these hot pools, which were just, after you've been hiking for like 20 days by that point, to go and sit and relax in the hot pools was quite a relaxing and refreshing experience. And it's like several days, it's multiple days walk from anywhere to get to them, so we had the whole place to ourselves.
Okay, that's pretty good. Actually, that just prompts me a question I haven't actually thought about asking you. How many people were on your trip?
I think they capped the numbers at 12. I think we had probably 11. People on the trip. So that's Generally for these trips, they need a minimum of 5 people. The way they do the pricing point is they need sort of 5 people to run the trip. And then obviously they're trying to get a few more people on that. And because it only runs once a year, I think they've run it for the last 13 years straight. Obviously during COVID times, it didn't happen, but otherwise they always get their numbers to be able to run the trips. And that's kind of a nice, when it's a month long, if it was just 5 of you, it might be, it's a bit strained, but to have sort of 11 people, there were Aussies, there was Americans, there was some Europeans, quite a multinational kind of group of people with quite a variety of experiences. It's always interesting hearing what other people have done in their hiking. There was one guy from Australia who'd done the Grand Himalayan Traverse across Nepal. So that's hardcore. That's like 5 months. You basically cross the entirety of Nepal. I can't remember. It's probably it's probably 1,500 kilometers, 2,000 kilometers. And so that was a pretty epic hike. He did that with World Expeditions. And so he had a good few stories to tell from there. So you get to know your fellow hikers well, but you also, especially if you've got your own tent, you've got a bit of privacy, when you need it.
Now, obviously with any trip, there's going to be some negatives. So what were the negatives of this trip from your perspective?
I think the main one is the cost. So it is not a cheap trip. As we mentioned earlier, there's this kind of $100 a day tourist tax effectively. And then when you add that up over like the itinerary for the mountain company, for example, is, I think it's 34-day trip in total with something like 27 days hiking on the Snowman, and then you've got the couple of days in the Har Valley, you've got the travel back from the end of the Snowman. So that just adds up and adds to the price. So I did a bit of a look before this at the 5 or 6 different companies that run the Snowman, and the prices were between $11,000 and $17,000 US. So it's not cheap. I have to say, when I look, I've got a little bit of a trip tracker where I put in like how much did I spend on this trip and how many days was it and what it works out as a cost per day. And on that basis, it was actually cheaper than going to kind of Uganda or Ethiopia or some other places I've been. But it's still, one of the more expensive trips that I've done. So that's probably one of the main things to consider. The weather, as I say, it was because you're starting off towards the end of the monsoon season, and I think now they've moved the start date back a couple of weeks. This has probably improved, but it still can be relatively variable. So that's kind of a consideration. As a kind of comparator, so a couple of years ago, I did the Kanchenjunga circuit in Nepal. So that's the third highest mountain in the world on the far eastern end of Nepal, bordering with India. It's an amazing trip. Probably one of the best hikes in Nepal. Very varied. It was at 25 days total, 16 days of hiking. So it's probably about 10 days shorter than the Snowman, but that was only 4,000 American dollars. So like a third of the price for in some ways it was comparable. Like it had better weather, there was better infrastructure, and it was a lot cheaper. But reflecting back on it, the Snowman had the better scenery. It definitely had more of a wilderness kind of feel if you want to really get away from everything. There was more culture, and there was also less development. So what I've seen in Nepal is every year the roads encroach on the ends of the hikes. And like the Annapurna is now a road all the way around, and a lot of the other hikes, every year they get a day or two shorter because the roads are just coming in. Whereas in Bhutan and the Snowman, that's not been an issue. So, it's not for everyone. It's expensive, it's hard, it's long, it's difficult, but it is, if you can afford it and this is your kind of thing, then it is an unforgettable experience.
Yeah, no, that's fine. That's fine. Okay, so one last question. What's your next great hiking adventure?
So in August, I'm going to do the Ladakh Sky Trail. So this is another trip with the mountain company. It'll be my third. And this is at the other end of the Himalayan range. So this is in Indian Himalaya, at the western end. And it's a 23-day trip, 18 days of hiking. I think there's 7 passes over 4,500 meters, and the highest pass is about 5,500 meters. So it's kind of comparable in height to the Snowman. But as I say, the landscape from the photos I've seen is completely different. And I have been to Ladakh before, and it's just very interesting kind of shades of color with the rocks, and it's very, very barren kind of landscape. And then at the bottom of the valleys, you've got these rivers running through, and beautiful green lush trees within about, 50 meters either side of the river. And then it's just rock and barrenness. So it's a really interesting kind of contrast, scenically. And it will be interesting just what the village life and the kind of culture is in that end of the Himalaya. That again is, Buddhism, sort of Tibetan Buddhism. So there should be some interesting kind of monasteries and things to see along the way. So that's this year's adventure. Okay.
That sounds like there certainly is a lot of stuff in that area that people just don't tend to think about. And it's, as you say, some of the trips aren't cheap and some are, but there's certainly a lot to offer. And, when they're talking about mountains, they're talking about real mountains, not just hills. Particularly when you're looking at Australia's of 2,400 meters is our highest. It's sort of a whole different concept of what mountains are.
Oh, exactly. And I think a lot of people think, and it makes sense. They think Himalaya, they think Nepal. And Nepal is, it's really well set up for hiking, and it's got some of the highest mountains. And there is, some amazing places. But, Bhutan and Ladakh and Pakistan, all offer quite different kind of Himalayan experiences. And so that's something I think if you're going to do your first hike in the Himalaya, you'd probably go to Nepal. But if you're looking for a second or third hike and for something which is scenically and culturally a bit different, have a think about those countries.
So we've been talking with Jonty Crane about hiking the Snowman Trek in Bhutan. Jonty, thanks for taking the time to fill us in on this little-known destination.
My pleasure.
So that was our interview with Jonty Crane on his 2019 Snowman Trek in Bhutan. Just before we throw in our 2 cents worth on this trip, I was going to say, if you have a chance and haven't already done so, go to the show notes for podcast 314 on the Australian Hiker website. We've got a small selection of images that Jonty's provided, as well as the links to the company that he used for this trip as well. As I mentioned at the start of the trip, we did Bhutan in 2012, and we were tossing up between the Snowman Track and the one that we did, which was the Laya to Gasa track. And really what it came down to was availability of time. We would have loved to have done the Snowman Track, but it was just the extra time associated with it just sort of ruled that out. This is still one of these trips that I would dearly love to do at some point in the future. But yeah, there are some pros and cons, which we'll talk about as we go on. I think from my perspective, people do talk about Nepal as being the tracking destination, and certainly from a mountaineering point of view, because of Everest, that's the real hub of that area. But I think Bhutan was a bit late to come onto the tourism scene, and as a result, they saw what was happening in Kathmandu. And as an example, there was, at least before the earthquake, there was a Starbucks in Kathmandu, whereas Bhutan's gone more the cultural route. They've tried to maintain their local heritage and their local culture. They don't specifically limit the number of tourists, but because they do have the tourist tax, for want of a better term, it rules out backpackers.
Well, it rules out a lot of people, I think. You really do have to have a little bit of money to spare to be able to go into Bhutan. You have to be on a tour, so you're either paying for an individual to be your guide the whole time, or you're joining a organised tour.
Yeah, and I think certainly from my perspective, I haven't done Nepal at all, but certainly Bhutan was spectacular. It had that cultural charm to it.
It was definitely a cultural experience, beginning to end, wasn't it?
Yeah, and the people, and I've got no idea what Nepal's like, but the people from Bhutan were just lovely. They just wanted to be there and talk to you and know what's going on.
Yeah, and share their world. That's what they wanted to do.
So, as Jonty said, only 50 people a year do the full Snowman Trek, approximately, and that was compared to in the year Jonty did his trip, 800 people summited Everest. So it gives you an indication of how few people actually do this sort of trip.
That probably means that it's quite a special experience as well. You are getting to see and do some things that 50 people a year only get to see.
Yeah. Now, this trip, as you mentioned, 350 kilometres in length, so it is a longer trip, 23 to 27 days duration, and that on top of that, there was about 4 to 7 days worth of travel. So just the duration of this trip is going to rule people out from that. And I think he said it was around about $14,000 to do the track.
Yeah.
So between the duration of the track and the cost, it's not something a lot of people are going to pick, but it's one of those once in a lifetime sort of trips that if you've got the time and the resources to do it, it's certainly worthwhile doing. Altitude seemed to be a big issue for this track, and again, there were 11 passes over 4,500 metres, and the highest of those was 5,345.
Wow.
And as he did say, that there are a number of different companies that do offer this track on there, but the one he went with, which was the Mountaineering Company, which is a UK-based company, had high altitude chamber. So with people that got altitude sickness, they could put them in there until they could organise a helicopter to get you out. And that's an issue with high altitude trips, that it doesn't matter how fit you are, it doesn't matter how many trips you've done, it can impact people when it's never impacted you before.
Yeah, that's right.
So certainly being fit and healthy helps, but it's not a guarantee that you won't get it.
Yeah, that's right.
One of the big things for this is if you ever do altitude trips, there's Diamox, which is actually a antibiotic, and it's also the thing they give you if you're going to an area where malaria is an issue. So, yeah, and it's, as he said, with the Diamox, some people would say, "Oh no, I'm not going to do it until I don't feel well," but it's the sort of thing that we took that attitude the last trip we did. And yeah, it made a big difference once we took it. So he said, take it when you've got it, and that way it does help. And they said they did some testing, and they did test blood oxygen levels, and they said it did make a difference for those people that were taking it compared to those that weren't.
Yeah, it is an interesting one that you've got this medication that's for, completely different purpose. You haven't started to, feel any difference or any impact of the altitude, but you're taking it. So yeah, it definitely, for us at least, was worth it.
Now, this hike does have a narrow window, and there's a reason for that. You've got to fit the end of the monsoon season in with the start of the snow season.
It's a very narrow window.
And it is a very narrow window. And so pretty much that's why it's not a trip that's offered all through the year. It's a fine line. He was saying that when he did the trip, it was sort of mid-September-ish, and they said the year after they pushed the trip back to early October. And he said, that the climate has changed over there, the seasons have changed, and where you were typically getting, almost being able to tell the time of the year because when the monsoon started, he said that has pushed back a bit later. And to give you an idea, this trip has a nickname of the Mudman Track because, as the monsoons are finishing, you've got a lot of muddy conditions around. So, you need to cater for that in choosing your gear. But by the end of the trip, he was saying that it was sunny and all the mud had disappeared. He also indicated that one of the required pieces of gear that they needed to carry with them was microspikes. And for those of you who aren't familiar, you might be familiar with crampons that are used for mountaineering. Microspikes are just a lightweight version of crampons. They slip on over your boots, a bit like chains fit on tires when you're going up to the snow. They give you that additional bit of traction. He was saying that they didn't need them, but it could have been if the snow had have come a bit earlier, that could have been an issue. Well, we did our trip in 2012 and it was a different trip, but we talked to the guide who had actually done the Snowman Track or guided the Snowman Track just before ours. And he was saying that they pretty much had rain for the entire time.
And the kind of mud that we were crawling through, literally, was, a fair chunk of the trip. Not always the case. I mean, Jonty's obviously had a good experience with the trip that he had. But again, you've got to be prepared for everything. That's why you're doing this.
And that's the thing with these sort of trips. You can't expect sunshine and rainbows on all these sort of trips. You take the good with the bad.
And it's an adventure. You're exploring, you're going to places where not many people go. That's the point of it. Otherwise, you would fly somewhere to a fancy resort and, have somebody serve you drinks the whole time. You could do that afterwards.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's certainly right. We briefly mentioned gear on this, and again, these are traditional sort of trips throughout the Himalayan region where the guides will bring in the tents and the kitchenware, and pretty much what you're carrying is your gear, and that's about it. One thing Jonty did say he wished he had bought was a decent down jacket. He said he said what he had wasn't quite enough. He had layering, but he said, the coldest temperatures they measured at nighttime were minus 10 degrees Celsius.
Whoa.
So,
I would have had everything on.
Yeah. But he was also saying that when he was walking during the daytime, he was down to a T-shirt.
Yes.
It was just when you were stopping that he'd have to put some layers back on again as you got colder.
Yeah. And when when you pause on those high passes, to take photos and to get taking the view and to have a little bit of a break, you can really start to chill down as well.
The other thing that's worthwhile that a lot of people tend not to think about is a good pair of sunglasses. And he was talking about category 4 sunglasses. Now, for most people, I can almost guarantee that most people would have no idea what category their sunglasses are. But typically when you're talking about category 4 sunglasses, if you imagine the glasses that have the little bits of leather on the side, and that's stop any sort of reflection, particularly from the snow conditions coming in through the side and impacting on your vision or causing snow blindness, basically. So it's the sort of thing that, your sunglasses you use at home may or may not be suitable enough for these sort of trips. Food situation, I think anytime you do an outdoor adventure, if the food is good, people are generally happy. There's an awful lot you can forgive if the weather's not so good. You certainly want to have, good food at the end of the day. And he was saying that the guides that were running the trip that he did had been doing it for 13 years. The cook had been doing it, or cook staff had been doing it for 10 years. And they take on board people's views and opinions after each trip, and they make adjustments as need be.
And they had it worked out.
Yeah. They know what people like. They know what's easy to cook in the conditions they've got. And again, the food with our trip was really good, and the food on Jonty's trip was really good. So again, that's the sort of thing that's worthwhile keeping in mind. He did also mention they bought a Bioletta Mocha coffee machine. Now, I don't know what that looks like. I'm guessing it's not a plug-in one, but it's one that's obviously there to provide good coffee for those coffee addicts around. And again, if you're into coffee, we certainly are. I tend to give up coffee on the trail because I'd rather not drink any coffee than drink bad coffee.
Yeah, that's right. Though what that means is you need to stop drinking coffee probably 3 or 4 days at least before you go on your trip. Otherwise, you end up with a horrendous headache, even if you're a light coffee drinker, which probably says it's not great for you. But anyway, I love it.
Now, he described a typical day on trail, and again, that really rung a bell with what we did. You know, basically, you wake up naturally, or they'll come and wake you up between 5:30 and 6. They tend to give you a cup of tea or coffee. Then you have breakfast at 7 and start walking at 8. So, again, you're not having to pack down your tent, but really it's getting your personal gear all sorted out. Lunch, typically between 12 and 1, and he did mention using thermoses and food thermoses, and that's something that we were used to as well, that they'd cook the meals at breakfast time. The guide would have the food thermoses, and then you'd eat out of that. You'd get to camp sometime between 1:30 and 3:30 p.m., although he did say they were a fast group. So in a lot of cases, they will always travel at the pace of the slowest walkers. But in this situation here, I think the sort of trip that it was, you're not going to get brand new hikers doing this sort of trip. I think it'll be hikers that are experienced and
seasoned,
also have got a bit of pace on them as well. So certainly that mate, you know, he said in one instance they actually beat the staff to the campsite.
Oops.
Afternoon drink of tea or coffee, and then again dinner between 6 and 6:30. And everyone disappears to their tents by around about 7:30. So pretty much that's the repeat for 26 days. And it's the sort of thing that you get into a habit. And if you've been pushing yourself, and Jonty did make the comment that altitude makes you feel like you're 40 years older. So,
oh, God.
From my perspective, I just found powering up the hills when I'm fit is fine. But I just found that I got really slow going up the hills. Downhills on the flat, different issue. Unfortunately, altitude sickness does not care if you're fit, if you're old, if you're young, it just happens.
But I think also it's just the impact of the altitude as well. So you might not necessarily be sick, but it will have some impact on you. And, again, if we come back to this whole, adventure and experience thing, you'll find that it's a leveler.
Now, in talking about what Jonty loved about this trail, and again, it was probably the same sort of thing that we loved about Bhutan as well, the people, the culture in general, the architecture, because they're trying to keep their country traditional. If you're going into the big cities, yes, you're starting to get multi-story buildings, and we're not talking about skyscrapers here, but sort of 4-story and that sort of thing buildings. But everywhere else, it's got that traditional-looking roof and frontage on it, just to sort of keep that cultural layer. Obviously, the landscape, the mountains and the mountain scenery.
Stunning. It's absolutely stunning country.
The wildlife. Although thankfully he was saying they didn't have any bugs, and that's just one of the advantages of the time of the year they were going, and just the incredible sense of remoteness. The downsides, as you mentioned, the trip price, he said it ranges between about $11,000 US to $17,000 US, depending on the company. And the company he went with, the mountain company, was $14,000 US. So that's not a cheap trip by any means. So I think from my perspective, this is one of these, as I said, this is one of these bucket list hikes that not everyone is ever going to do. It's going to be, you do it because it's a once in a lifetime sort of trip. And then you go back to things that are cheaper, and you're in your tent, and you're not having to go overseas to do these amazing trips. But certainly, as I said, it'd be one of these things that, all things being given equal, is a trip that I'd love to do.
Well, the other thing you can do is live vicariously through Jonty's experience. Thank you, Jonty, for sharing all of that. Your bucket list, Tim, is getting so long. I'm not sure that, if you did one or two every year for the rest of your life, I'm pretty sure you wouldn't get to the end of it.
No, I think that's about right. I'm going to have to start very much narrowing these down. Okay, we hope you've enjoyed Jonty Crane's trip on the Snowman Trek. It's certainly something that is reinvigorated me to at least add it to my list. Whether I do it or not, I don't know. But yeah, it's been a great experience to hear about. That's all for me. Bye for now.
And bye from me.